My purpose will not to talk about SOA in general, but to focus on SOA in DoD, which is the subject of today's meeting. One way of characterizing what SOA is all about is to make order of what this person is looking at. The systems in DoD are divided in thousands of pieces, but let me give you an economic analysis. There are only 43 projects in fiscal 07 with a budget in excess of 100 million. None of them are SOA. There are 525 projects with a budget in excess of 10 million, and only 3 pilots are in place so far as I know. The sum of the projects in excess of 10 million is 84 million, accounts for 84% of the total IT spending. The conclusion you could take from this chart is that the SOA opportunity is enormous. It is in the order of $25 to $28 billion a year from now on, involves a large number of projects. Let me also comment about the 2,832 projects which are below 10 million. It turns out that those projects in many respects are fix-ups and arrangements that people make on a Humvee in Iraq in order to remain operational. So when you are really talking about the job that needs to be done, it really encompasses a huge amount of money. So the question then is, what is network-centric SOA? And I want to emphasize, I will only talk today about network-centric SOA. SOA has a much bigger scope. There is more to systems than SOA. SOA, network-centric, has the capacity to discover applications anywhere. You sit in a Humvee in Iraq, and you need a set of applications in that instant, and you get them from the network. At the same time, you display the capability of applications, but most importantly, you discover the network data from the data registry. In other words, when you're sitting in the Humvee in Iraq, you may have a set of questions that have never been asked before, and you want an answer to that question in Google speed. And I want to define Google speed so that we clearly understand what is my definition of what is network-centric performance. Google speed means response to a complex inquiry involving thousands of participating computers, involving dozens of applications, and getting an answer in a quarter of a second. That is SOA. And let me repeat it. Until you put a dimension of Google speed on a network-centric environment, you really don't know what you're talking about. Now, just want to go over history. We know what the functional applications are. Enterprise applications are things which are connecting things horizontally. The large DoD applications today that account for about 40% of total spending are enterprise applications. They are huge isolated silos. About a third of them are SAP applications, or pretending to be SAP, or still in the development process of trying to install SAP. Now, while that is taking place, SOA applications are rising, and the SOA application has the attribute that it deals with allies, contractors, and service providers. Now, why does the existing system not function? It does not function because it has been built into approximately, any way you look at it, approximately 2,000 silos. And if you want to connect these silos in any way with anything unusual, you cannot get response out of a system like that in Google time, which is 1/4 of a second. Now, the first question that you have to ask, are we set up for SOA in DoD? And the answer to that thing is emphatically yes, yes, yes. Here is a partial list of policies on the books. I have listed them. There's also directives and memoranda. Many of them are of recent origin. So if there is a question whether SOA is being blocked by policy, the answer is no. SOA is being blocked by inability to execute. Now let me make sure that you understand that the responsibility for SOA is clearly defined. So when you start looking for places where to point, where to go, it is quite clear, defined on May 2nd, 2005, of recent origin, that the ASD, NII, DoD CIO, John Grimes, is accountable for SOA. That's where the buck stops. And that's clear, unambiguous, and there's no escape clause from that particular directive. Now, I have listed for you a long list of directives which influence the creation of SOA, and I would like to focus on the one which is the killer directive. If you don't get this one right, all the other things fall apart. It happens to be that I am very much interested in data, but when you look at the map and the picture of DoD systems, interoperability is really an issue not of connectivity. In other words, you can have all the gigs, all the network-centric wires running. You can run fiber to every Humvee in the world and still not get SOA. You get SOA only if you have the capability of data sharing. That means data shall be visible, accessible, and understandable to any user. Data assets shall be made visible by associating metadata for each asset. Data assets must be understandable by publishing semantic metadata as part of a data registry. Now let me emphasize the direction of semantic metadata. You cannot just say, here is a field that I have defined, and that is an adequate definition, because there are many variants of understanding and meaning. Clearly, we have examples where the same word used by the Air Force and by the Marine means totally different things. So all I want you to know that it is very important that the metadata register is semantically complete. We have not started doing semantic data tagging as yet in DoD, except in, so far as I can tell, and I may be wrong, in 3 pilots. Second, we must make sure that things are uniquely identifiable. In other words, if I want to use the SOA environment, go into the network and start assembling from a diverse collection of databases that may be globally spread, involving not only data from DoD, but also from allies and from suppliers, I need some sort of a tagging ability to do so. And this is the second requirement for SOA is UID, or whatever variant ultimately will come through. Again, our presence of UIDs right now is very sparse. Now, before I get into the details of what this all means, I want to bother you with some numbers, because we have to understand what does it cost us not to have SOA. Now, this is a very controversial slide. You'll get a copy of it. You may use it any way you see wish, but these are my numbers. This is the third year that I've published similar numbers. And what they basically say, out of the total spending of $30.5 billion, you spend $2 billion on logistics, $1.8 billion on HR, finance, $1 billion, etc. The warfighters get 10%, 36% of it, $10.8 billion. But the bulk of the money is going into the infrastructure. In other words, the stuff that just sits there, the wires, the systems, the security, all of the support things which don't do anything for anybody except enables the applications to work, in my estimate, accounts for 47% of the total cost. Now, why is this so? Very simply, that if you have built a system over a period of years and spent about $2 trillion on it, you have built silos, and each silo has its own IT infrastructure, has built its own communication protocol, its own databases, and money accumulates. So my estimate is 47% is for the infrastructure. Now, that has vast implication, economic implications, on what you do if you go with SOA. Now, before I go away from the first slide, namely the spending, I want to get into the subject of contractors. There are lots of contractors here, so I'm going to tell you how great you are. Guys, you are spending 75.6% of total spending. In other words, the bulk of the money from DoD is going to contractors. And by the way, the bulk of the money that DoD spends organically is going into administration of contractors. Everybody understands that. So what you have to understand is, if you have built that many silos and you have parceled it out among God-fearing, patriotic contractors, then you have 79% of contractors making sure that the infrastructure stays within their control and within the scope of the contract. That's the nature of how acquisition works. You go and do an RFQ, and then you give somebody a job, and they do their own infrastructure. So I just want to understand that what I talk about today is toxic to contractors. So now let me go into the concepts. Now that we understand the dimensions of SOA from standpoint of DoD, the question is, well, how will this work? Where do we go? I mean, there must be a way of solving these issues and dealing with these issues. The first thing that I would like to address is the propensity on the part of DoD to pursue a federation or tiered accountability approach to SOA. There are policies, by the way, on federation and tiered accountability. And what do the policies say? They say, units in DoD shall operate under a common set of rules. And nobody will disagree with that, right? Second, SOA is based on trust and security among autonomous units. So if you have hundreds or thousands of autonomous units, they have to trust one another. So if I send a message in real time so that it goes into your computer and comes back so that I can give an answer in quarter of a second, Google speed. I have to trust you, and you have to trust me. Now, the problem is that we have not as yet articulated where and when do common SOA rules apply. They apply to the other people, not to me, because I'm currently on a project and I cannot stop that project. I have a contract. And the contractor would need modification of the statement of work in order to accommodate SOA rules. So SOA rules would be an extra, properly marked up, by the way. And also the question of an SOA trust and security is a dicey problem because we have a problem of security, integrity, interoperability, and the increased onslaught on DoD from a standpoint of information warfare. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, if I'm a commander somewhere, I'm going to first protect myself. I'm going to first take care, trust and security, and maybe, Colonel, in the first row, I will trust you after you and I have a lunch and have a good drink, and maybe I trust you, maybe I don't. But that is the issue, and I think this goes to the heart of the governance issue. If DoD shall operate under a common set of rules, and that's what the directive says, and it was signed by the Deputy Secretary, then the common set of rules have to be enforced. And there must be an enforcement mechanism. Now, the enforcement mechanism is in place. The problem, of course, is the budget, moving the budget accordingly. So all I want you to know, SOA is being hindered right now by our inability to operate under a common set of rules. We're moving in the right direction. These things are getting negotiated increasingly. Enclaves have formed which negotiate now a common set of rules. But let me just say that has not as yet achieved the SOA objectives. To amuse you, and I don't know what else I can say, you could ask the question, well, all right, we understand John Grimes is responsible for SOA, but John cannot do it all by himself. You know, things are done in a collaborative way. And indeed, there's a whole bunch of bodies. This is a partial list. I exhausted the list, so I just filled up one slide. But this is the various boards currently active, so far as I can tell, that have a finger in the pie of SOA. Not all of it, but pieces of it. And so one of the problems you'll have in establishing common set of rules is you have to go and get your ticket punched and a stamp put on from one of these boards. And I believe that's a tough job. It's getting done. Partial boards are being created to fulfill specific communication problems like parts of the interoperability between intelligence and warfighters. Stratcom, in fact, is being negotiated. And that is being done by one of these boards, but it still doesn't answer the big question. Second question, of course, is who is going to build it? So, you know, we know who's responsible, we know what the policy is, we know who the boards are. We still have to find somebody to build it. Now, we have found that the thing is rather in turmoil, although it's quite clear that U.S. Stratcom is responsible for planning, integrating, and coordinating net ops, but they're not building it. They are doing the planning. Then the DoD gig and JTF GNO through DISA is supposed to build a thing using a thing called NCES to support it. And then sitting to the side is the Business Transformation Agency that is also developing systems. So you have the warfighter piece being done by Stratcom. DISA is doing an NCES pilot to support that. And then there's a Business Transformation Agency, which is going around looking for a way of achieving SOA. And the question then is, what do you build if you have been given the job to build SOA? And we know exactly what that is. There is no question about what it takes to build an SOA. You have to have service discovery, service management, mediation, metadata, messaging, people discovery, service security, and application hosting. I gave you the top level list of things that you have to put into place in order to have an SOA. Each of these things, each of these pieces are massive investments in software. But nevertheless, we understand what they are. There is a long list of vendors who claim they can deliver it to you. There's a long list of vendors who will bid on all of these things or pieces. And now it's your job, Colonel, to go and pick it and start awarding contracts so you can build it. The thing gets a little complicated on the business side of the fence, because we now have a bill about a chief management officer with substantial seniority and will act as the management officers from the Army, Navy, and Air Force, approve budgets, and will approve requests for business systems, and will deal as the intermediaries Congress. So all I want you to know, in addition to Stratcom and DISA, we also have the Chief Management Officer. How that will operate is unknown at this point. It's an unknown variable in the SOA equation. So what is the intellectual capability, the intellectual integrity of SOA? Turns out it's pretty good. Almost unanimously, when you deal with conceptual presentations, all of the presentation looks like something like this. They say there's going to be an enterprise information environment. There are going to be business missions. Then there are going to be the services, agencies, and commands. And then you're going to have programs. So from a broad diagram standpoint, I must give great credit to whoever drew this diagram for the first time, because it has now been repeated many, many times in many, many presentations with slight variations. But they all say there must be an enterprise information environment. And the question then, of course, arises, okay, is this going to be the same enterprise information environment for business, warfighting, and intelligence? And this is where the things get squishy, but nevertheless, so far the drawing boards have this diagram. When you go into further details, you get the typical layer diagram, vendors and various services and various lieutenant colonels and colonels love to make presentations that look something like this. I have seen many dozens of diagrams like this, but you always have at the bottom enterprise information mission area, governance, communication, computing, core services, information assurance as a shared capability. By the way, the first time this diagram was drawn was in 1992. So I just want you to know it is a venerable pedigree. What it means if something continues that long, there must be some truth to it and some reality. So let me now take apart the infrastructure services, because that's the key. What are the components of infrastructure services? What pieces of SOA are supposed to be shared across DoD units? The answer is data services, security services, computing services. Let me just emphasize computing services. That means the grid, the computing grid. It's a bunch of virtualized machines anywhere. It's a cloud. And they're all out there really working together to do whatever people ask for. Communication services and application services. So this is really the master diagram of SOA. Again, let me repeat it. The infrastructure services is the layer below everything else that lays on top of it. The infrastructure services have data, security, computing, communication, and application services. It's perfectly logical. This diagram was drawn in 1992 and has never changed. So let me take the most important piece of the infrastructure service, which is data services. You need discovery services, management services, collaboration services, interoperability, and semantic services. And each of them can be broken down. But we understand what it takes to do data services. It is a big deal. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a big deal. I would say if we are lucky, we are going to get it done in 7 to 10 years. Because you have to go in piece by piece, foxhole by foxhole, and dig up the data which are either inconsistent, incompatible, variant, or semantically without meaning. It's a big deal. And that means that when you do data services, you have to follow certain principles. The first one is very important, and I want to emphasize it. Data services and applications belong to the enterprise. Data does not belong to a major on a base, at whatever base he is. Data belongs to the enterprise. If you want to have interoperability, the data has to be common and accessible. It's a strategic asset. Data and applications cannot be coupled. When I look at the thousands of applications which are today in place, the data and applications are welded, tack welded, and then you have a bunch of contractors sitting there with blowtorches making sure they stay welded. Must be visible, data must be visible. Now, it doesn't have to be visible to everybody, but it has to be visible. It should be obtained from dictionary, not from summaries. Semantics and syntax is defined by community of interest, and data must be trustworthy by casual user. So now the question I have, how will individual projects comply with that? This is what you want to do, and I give you a list. And this is what we have, which is legacy-based data all over the place and data buried in projects. And that is what transition to SOA is all about. Let me tell you, we are going to go this way. DoD is going to go this way. Data, which is common and discoverable, is going to be the future of DoD. No question about it. The question is, when do we get there and how fast? And how do we weld the data from individual projects and from legacy databases into this environment? But this is the future. Communication. You need interoperability, spectrum management, very important. The whole issue of how you manage the spectrum, which is growing in tremendous degree in demand for services. Connectivity, continuity of services, and resource management. Continuity of services means that the system never fails. We have a system in the Navy, I don't want to mention it. You know, it's very proud to have an 87% continuity of service. Now, that sounds pretty good to me, except if you are a statistician, you would understand it's a disaster. That just, because of the statistical distribution, if the average is 86, 87%, you have incidents during peak hour where nothing works. You can't have that. So therefore, you need to have gig net ops that will allow ability to share information at any time and must be implemented as a unified enterprise. So the question is, how will the projects come in from private networks into a shared network? Most importantly, gig does not provide end-to-end connectivity right now. You know, the last mile, the last drop. So the question is, how do you assure local connectivity? And the whole question of wireless communication becomes very critical in this connectivity. The question of latency, again, if you want to go Google speed at quarter of a second, how do you do that? How do you engineer a network that will do that? And then how do you peel existing networks into the new environment? Next, just in case you thought this was easy, let me make things more difficult. Computing services, you must have computing services, data centers, resource planning, quality control, configuration, and financial management. You have to create a utility. You have to create a computing environment that has most likely 500,000 servers distributed in several locations. Now you say, well, what the hell would we do with 500,000 servers? Well, most likely that's what we got now anyway. It's all tucked away in somebody's closet, you know, one server at a time. So we just say the computing services and how you connect them into a Google-like environment. But it's not Google alone. There are new utilities, like the latest utility that Amazon has announced, where you have what's called the cloud. By the way, the cloud is the latest word. A cloud is lots of servers all over the place, and when you go in, you never know which will execute what because things are done in triplicate, just to make sure that things get delivered. So you need an adaptable hosting environment, you need a distributed infrastructure, and you need shared computer resources. And the question arises, how will you get DoD data centers deliver high performance, high security, redundancy, and redundant connectivity? And let me repeat redundant connectivity. The most vulnerable part of DoD is the information environment. Any enemy will not go after our aircraft carriers. They will not go after our B-2s. There is a much cheaper way to go and get DoD. And therefore, the computing services is where you're going to attack. And that has to be then redundant and protected. Now that I described the challenge, and let me repeat the challenge, DoD will do SOA. DoD will execute DoD SOA environment. DoD will install an enterprise environment. The question is when and at what cost. So the question is, what are the steps we are taking to move in that direction? The number one project pilot underway is NCES, and it's run by DISA. It has messaging, collaboration, mediation, contact discovery, many of the pieces which it's supposed to have. Actually, it is in version 4 user test. It does a whole lot of things. Very importantly, it has NIPRNet and CIPRNet. Very importantly, it does link to the metadata registry. Although that's not in real time, nevertheless, it does that. The problem with the NCS user test, it is concentrates on infrastructure, which is right by my book. But it still doesn't have enough. You know, this is one hand clapping. You have an infrastructure, but you still need applications. So that is yet to be done. It is highly dependent on BEA software, and the intelligence mission is yet in the process of getting developed, but it's coming. So the milestone C is March 2008, IOC 2009, and the SOA migration starts in 2010. And my question is, this may be a nice leisurely pace, and it may be okay if we had no enemies. It may be okay if nobody is coming on our tail. And so the question is, are we, while NCS is completing their pilot, are there projects coming along that are ready to jump on the IOC, initial operational capability, to start moving with the execution of SOA? And the metadata register inclusion into projects is as yet unknown. So what is missing? Applications. There's a whole list of things that applications have to have. The most important one that I want to single out is a DoD portal. In my book, that is one of the key requirements for SOA. And that is still in the process of development. AKO has done, the Army has done an outstanding job on a portal. It has over 2 million people accessible with certain functionality. But that is not good enough because there are many other things that need to be done. So the question is, how do you move the tribe from Egypt to the Promised Land without going through the desert for 40 years? You all know your Bible, and you all know that there is a shortcut from Egypt to the Promised Land, and it takes only 2 weeks' worth of walking. So the question is, how are you going to do it? And the answer is, you need middleware for transformation of applications. You cannot do it on a straight way. You have to go through transformation applications. You have to take your legacy applications, leave them in a place as long as you can, and then do the middleware to move to SOA. And that is the task ahead. And you have a number of vendors, many of them are here today, I suppose, who are offering transformation middleware. Some are better, some are worse. Some are doing it because it's the thing to do, because SOA is the initials to put on any presentation. You just take all presentations and put SOA on it. I want to single out a particular incident of middleware which is called VMware, virtual memoryware. This is virtualization. it is a shortcut to transformation. Virtualization means that you can basically collapse both your applications and your data centers through a sophisticated middleware process and gain some time. And that means, of course, if you want to do that, you must enforce standards. Without standards, SOA will not fly. You must have universal description discovery. You must have web service description. You must have SOAP. And you must have these standards, open standards. Now, every vendor will claim they have open standards. Don't believe a word of it. You have to have clearly certified open standards that will assure DoD that we will have the flexibility to move our application the way we see fit. Now, what we need, of course, to do the migration, if you want to go from Egypt to the Promised Land real fast, you may need some chariots. Because just walking along when you have too many sick people, you know, people are going to die on the way. That's a good analogy. So what you need to do, you have to start buying some common end-user interface tools, application generators, test suite, error identification, standard utilities. And then you have to start buying services components like email environments, collaboration tool, information dashboard, portals. So, in other words, you have to start buying and putting into the transition package open systems tools which are SOA-like. Now, they are not SOA. Email is not SOA. But email embedded in a transition environment as a tool becomes part of an SOA plan. So let me then ask, now that you've listened to a discussion of SOA and DoD, there is a good question you should ask, well, why the hell should we do it? You know, why not leave things the way they are? Things are paying contractors. Contractors are getting paid. People have jobs, although shrinking jobs. But nevertheless, why should we do it, and why not continue the way we are? The answer is economics. Now, let me make the case now for why DoD must make SOA, and it's primarily an economical issue. Although combat capability, you could always spend more money. But we don't have the money. The money is getting short. And the existing system is just too expensive. And what I'm trying to say that the current cost of equipment and software, which is maybe 50 to 60% of the cost of DoD, mostly contractor, is too much money. And the reason is everybody is redoing things over and over and over and over again. By streamlining it into an enterprise environment, my estimate, and by the way, this estimate hasn't changed in 15 years, is that if you make equipment which is very cheap, particularly virtualized equipment is very cheap, and software, you can bring it under 20% of the cost because you have taken the duplication of communication protocols, data protocols, security protocols, access protocols out. The other long-term access is data and communication. You're spending too much money on data because the data is repeated over and over. We have multiple communication networks, LANs, WANs, and direct links. I have a long list of proliferation networks which are not compatible. They are now close to 40% of the cost. That should come down under 30%, and the reason it doesn't come down more is because you have to greatly increase the capability of the communication network. The communication bandwidth environment in the 21st century, as I will be showing you in a moment, is vastly greater than what we have today. But what you have to do with the savings is start moving it back to DoD. I'm a strong believer that the systems integrator should be DoD, not a contractor. I'm a strong believer that we have to rebuild a workforce of systems architects, system designers, systems organizers to deliver this environment to DoD in the next decade. And that means this is where the money should go. The money should go into rebuilding the customer and the integration capability of DoD. So what you're seeing here is a total reallocation of money out of software and hardware and redundant communications into human capital that should reside in DoD as a warfare capability. Now, why is this important? While we are sitting here, the world is exploding. The information requirements on the world are exploding at the rate of 50 to 60% per year because of all of the new services that are coming and as people start migrating to the net. We cannot operate DoD on the net because the net is toxic. We must own our own information network environment. But let me just show you that when we go to the future, we have to provide our fighters with a sense and response capability. We're talking about millions of sensors out there in the battlefield, collecting information that have to be displayed in a usable form to the fighter for execution. And so we are talking about 1,000 billion, trillion, or whatever the number is, an enormous number of data sources that have to be integrated and brought in a humanly actionable form to the warfighter. So we are dealing now with an environment which has a capacity of well over 1,000 billion transactions per hour as a design requirement. By the way, my estimate of today's DoD capability is a small fraction of that number. We need an enormous expansion of transaction handling capability, particularly under condition of duress. So, in summary, what does it all mean? SOA is necessary. It requires standardization. It requires you shedding obsolete assets. SOA is a driver, not the only one, by the way. There are many other drivers, but this is just the software piece in an arms race. And SOA is enabling to become a weapon in the information warfare. It's not the only means we have for information warfare, but it is necessary. Now, my view is that the current pace of SOA implementation is unsatisfactory. Why do I say so? Well, I read the newspapers. World War IV has already started. I don't know how many of you rested leisurely through World War III, which was the Cold War. But it has come and gone, thanks God. But the next one that has started already is a pretty nasty one. And it's particularly the beauty of World War III, if I can say that it was beautiful, was the Soviets were just like DoD, and DoD was just like Soviets. So you know, you just imitated your enemy, and if you could turn around a little faster, you always were ahead. World War IV is not played by those rules. They are not playing our rules. This is tough tough. And therefore, information superiority becomes a requirement for military capability in World War IV. So my conclusion is, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad that so many of you showed up today. You clearly understand the importance of SOA. You clearly understand that SOA is necessary for DoD information superiority. Thank you very much.